Hi, my name is Isha Agarwal, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and today I'll be presenting my research on lattice-based cryptography. In recent years, there's been increasing interest in quantum computing due to its enhanced computing power. As you can see on the diagram on the right, this enhanced computing power stems from the complex nature of a qubit, the basic unit of information on a quantum computer as compared to a classical bit. While this enhanced computing power is excellent for innovation, it's also problematic for security reasons because quantum computers can break some of the widely used cryptographic protocols such as RSA. This means that all digital transactions, including emails and bank accounts, are at risk, and hence we need new quantum-resistant algorithms. And this is where lattice-based cryptography comes in. As you can see, a lattice is a regularly spaced grid, and there exist these extremely hard problems involving these lattices that are NP-hard and have a high average case complexity. Having a high average case complexity means that a randomly generated instance of one of these problems will reduce to the complexity of the worst case. These two attributes make lattice problems the perfect candidate for these new quantum-resistant algorithms. Further, a basis in lattice-based cryptography is a set of vectors used to generate all points in the lattice. In this example, the basis is the red and gray vectors. Next, the most fundamental hard problem in lattice-based cryptography is the shortest vector problem, which states, given a basis for a lattice, find the shortest non-zero vector in the lattice produced by the basis. In this diagram, the shortest possible vector in this lattice will be this green vector over here. As I was experimenting with the shortest vector problem, I noticed that could be estimated quite accurately. I determined a heuristic by running experiments which is 2/3 the minimum vector length in the basis. And as you can see, this heuristic quite accurately follows the trends of the actual length of the shortest vector. So then I did more reading, and I discovered something called the Gaussian heuristic, which can be used to estimate the length of the shortest vector for random lattices, or lattices where all the entries are randomly generated. And as you can see on the left, the Gaussian heuristic is a much better fit for the actual length of the shortest vector than my experimentally determined heuristic. However, isn't this a giant contradiction? Because we just said that the shortest vector problem is this extremely hard problem. So then how come it can be estimated so precisely? In order to discover the answer to this question, I came across this gap in lattice-based cryptography between what has been proven in theory and what has been seen in practice. So on a high level, the Gaussian heuristic implies that some lattices have predictable lengths of the shortest vectors, while others do not. This ties into this larger idea of how not all lattice problems reduce to the worst case complexity. An example is the NTRU lattices used in the NTRU cryptosystem system. While there do exist cryptographic protocols based on lattices that reduce to the worst case complexity, these cryptographic protocols are not very efficient and thus not practical for the real world. Further, I found that much of this gap between theory and practice stems from there not being much understanding of particular instances of lattice problems. And hence, in order to supplement current research and bridge this gap between theory and practice, we asked the following research questions. First, can we accurately estimate the length of the shortest vector in a lattice given some features of the lattice? And second, how does the accuracy of our estimates compare across different types of matrices? In order to answer this question, we implemented a linear regression machine learning model. First, we chose different types of matrices, including the NTRU matrices used in the NTRU cryptosystem system, Q-array, a close variant of NTRU, completely random lattices, and lattices where the entries were pattern or dependent, such as the Fibonacci numbers. Then we collected data about features of these different types of lattices, including the dimension, the diagonal sum, the determinant, and even the Gaussian heuristic. And then we inputted these features into a linear regression machine learning model, from which we extracted feature labels, which we could then use to predict the length of the shortest vector. And finally, we calculated the R-squared value of this model in order to evaluate its performance and compare the predictabilities of the different types of matrices. This table summarizes the performance of the linear regression machine learning model. As you can see, the R-squared value for most of these matrices is above 0.9. This means that over 90% of the variability in the data could be explained by the model in most cases. In particular, we can note that NTRU matrices, the matrices used in the NTRU cryptosystem, had the highest R-squared value of 0.996, which means it was the most predictable matrix that we tested. Does this mean that the NTRU cryptosystem is not secure? Yes and no. No, because we only tested dimensions up to about 50, when in practice dimensions greater than about 300 are used. However, the fact that NTRU had the highest R-squared value suggests that it might not embody some of the traits of the unpredictable lattices, and that there might be better alternatives worth investigating further. Next, we can note that QArray, the closed brand of NTRU, had a slightly lower R-squared value. And finally, the most jarring result on this table, the Fibonacci variance of the lattices that we tested had a significantly lower R-squared value. So let's deconstruct these results a bit further. So as we noted on the previous slide, NTRU matrices were slightly more predictable than QArray matrices because they had a slightly higher R-squared value. And the main difference between NTRU and QArray matrices is symmetry. NTRU matrices exhibit more symmetry across the diagonals and have square block sizes, whereas QArray can sometimes have rectangular block sizes. And hence we can conjecture that symmetric matrices are easier to predict than those that are more irregular. And now let's look at the Fibonacci numbers. As we noted on the previous slide, the R-squared value was significantly worse for the Fibonacci matrices as compared to all of the other matrices that we tested. To understand why this is, we can turn to the Gaussian heuristic. Remember that when we defined the Gaussian heuristic, we said that it worked for random lattices, and thus it doesn't work for lattices where we have pattern or dependent entries such as the Fibonacci numbers. And hence, we can conjecture that the reason that we saw these significantly lower R-squared values for the Fibonacci matrices was because the Gaussian heuristic wasn't able to give the linear regression machine model a clear picture of what was going on with the data. And in fact, we can support this conjecture by looking at correlation matrices. So in a correlation matrix, each square represents the correlation coefficient, or R, between each variable on the axis. So when we compare the Gaussian heuristic to the shortest factor length for pure QArray matrices where we have these completely random entries, we can see that the R value is very close to 1. However, when we substitute those completely random entries with the Fibonacci matrix numbers in the QArray matrices, we can see that the R value for the Gaussian heuristic compared to the shortest vector length is more like 0.7, which accounts for the significantly lower R-squared values that we saw. And hence we can conclude that matrices with random entries are more predictable than matrices with pattern or dependent entries. So in conclusion, this study defined a metric that can be used to evaluate candidates for lattice-based cryptosystems. Using this metric, we were able to determine that the shortest factor problem is actually quite predictable for small dimensions. Furthermore, we determined that this predictability varies based on A, the symmetry of a matrix, and B, the randomness of its entries. This study is important for finding unpredictable lattices, which can be used to create secure, quantum-resistant lattice-based cryptosystems. Ultimately, such cryptosystems will allow us to maintain notions of security and privacy in a modern world. Future work in this area includes looking at higher dimensions, implementing a more complex model by using deep learning or looking at more features, and potentially even using machine learning to synthesize secure matrices for cryptographic protocols. I would like to thank my amazing mentor Jacob Amola for all of his help. This project would not have been possible without him helping me every step of the way. My research lab group for their helpful feedback, the SSI staff for teaching me the skills necessary to do this project and for this amazing opportunity, and finally my family for supporting me. Here are my references. Thank you for listening to my presentation.